In today's video, I'm going to show how I stitch numerals on my slow stitching pieces. Now I'm just going to show you how I stitch a number, but because of the number, well, this video is really geared towards you. I wanted to thank everyone who subscribed to my channel and all the viewers. Thanks to you, I have 10,000 subscribers, and that is not lost on me. That is an incredible feat, and I appreciate your comments and your time that you spend with me. Now, I slow stitched a panel with the numbers 10,000 to commemorate this occasion. But I wanted to show you how I stitch numbers in my slow stitching and how I make it personal or unique to the piece I'm working on. I have a few tips that I share along the way just to make the piece stand out and be unique. So let's get started. So here's a closer look at the numbers. I had a fabric collage for the background, and then I stitched the numbers, and I used a black embroidery floss to stitch the outline, and then I filled them in. And if you look closer here, you can see that there are French knots, and there are dashes, and there are different lines here. I just emphasized the curves from the zeros and just focused on that rectangular shape for the one. I also filled in the comma here. For the background, I just did some straight stitching just to create a finished piece for the background. So now to stitch the number, you can use any type of font you want. You can print out some font or reference it, or you can just create your own. The key that I found is to make a thick line. So here I created an outline and I filled it in just with some little straight stitches. Here I created the line and then I went over it with a satin stitch just to really emphasize and make that a little more solid. Now here I did single line, but for the number 1 I did 3 of them, so that really has some weight and substantialness to the piece. On this one I did 2 outlines, but I didn't make them a closed shape. I kept them open, so it's a larger 3 with a smaller 3 inside of it. Here I did the same thing, but I filled in part of the number. And here I did a long and short stitch with a gradient. So I went from dark brown all the way up to a golden color, and it just created that number. Now a tip is if you're going to have a number that's more than just a single digit, just create them all in the same coloring. So for this one I did both of them, so that's a 58 as opposed to just a 5 or an 8. And the same thing here with the 7. Because it was such a thin stitch, I created an outline. So to do this in your work, these are just some examples, you can use just a single piece of fabric. And if you do, I suggest you use a embroidery hoop to hold your fabric taut, and this way you can really get a nice feel. Sometimes the fabric without the tautness is just a little floppy. Another alternative is to just back it with a second piece of fabric if you don't want to use the hoop. So I like to take my fabric and then I just back it with an old piece of quilting. You can use batting, you can use just another piece of fabric as well. Now from here, I'm just going to take my erasable pen and create the outline. So I just sketch lightly at number 2, and then I can come back and really play with it to make the shape that I want. So I'm going to just make the outline and then we'll fill it in just with some straight stitches. But again, you don't have to limit yourself to just the straight stitches. So I'm creating that too. As you can see, it's not pretty at first, but it starts to take on the shape. So once I'm happy with the number that I have, I can start my stitching. Now I've chosen to use a turquoise thread for the outline here, so I'm going to stitch the outline, and I have some choices to make. I can use any stitch that I want. I can use just little back stitches to create a nice outline shape, or I can create a stem stitch or even a split stitch just to really show a nice straight line. And so that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to create that split stitch. So I like to start at one corner, but you can start anywhere on your piece. And I just come up through the fabric, and then I just go a little distance of the way, pull it snug but not too taut, and then come up through that stitch. Now I like split stitches because they're great for curves. You can just create that curve following that sketch, and every time you come up through the stitch you get a small little angle. and that creates a nice rounded shape, because some numbers, like numbers 2 and 0, 8, they all have those rounded edges to them, just to different degrees. So I'll continue all the way around my number, creating that outline. And I just follow through, trying to keep all my stitches approximately the same length. And then coming up maybe half to 3/4 of the way, maybe 2/3 of the way through each stitch. If I have a tight curve, I'll adjust my stitches and make them a little shorter. And as you can see here, I'm just pushing the stitch to really follow that guideline. Some of the areas, particularly on a number 2, aren't always straight or aren't always curved. So on the straightaways, I can make a little bit larger stitches if I want to. And I'll just continue the length of the number here. Now on certain numbers, just like with certain fonts, if the little edge is a little tight, I'll just do a back stitch to fill it in. Or if I realize that I made the wrong angle, I'll just go back in and fill that in. And it's very forgiving this way. I find that these stitches that create those solid lines make a nice outline. So I'll just continue going over them until I get the look that I want. And I'll show you it when it's complete. So now that my outline is complete, now is a good time to erase those extra marks just so I can see exactly what I'm working with here, in case I want to fill in stitches on my number. So I'll just take a hot iron and press down over the areas that I use that marker, and that's just a Frixian pen from the office supply section. And as you can see, it removes any of the marks that I made with the marker, just as my guidelines. Now, if I wanted to continue this and put in specific stitches, I can take my marker again and make guidelines if I wanted to use some French knots or little crosses or something to that effect. But I'm just going to fill this in with just little dashed lines. Here I have some seed stitches where they go every which way, but I'm just going to mimic the shape of that number 2. And for that, I'm going to use smaller thread here, just some pearl. So now to do that, I'm just going to start here in the center. And this is a much thinner thread, and the color coordinates with the existing one. It's not an exact match, but it's pretty close. And I'm just going to make my straight stitches. I'm keeping them small and just dividing my number in half, essentially, right down the center. So I like to start at the bottom on this number because it's a straightaway, so that's pretty easy. And then I just go right up to the halfway point of my next section. So I'll turn this so I can continue creating these little dashes inside my number. Now, it may have been helpful to create with the marker where I want those stitches to go as a guide, and I can always stop and do that, but I think I've got the hang of it. Now I want to go right through that curved area, and it's just stitches, so if I don't like the way it looks, I can try and pull them out, or I can even cut them out if they seem to get knotted in place. You can change the color of your thread that you use if you want to fill in your numbers, but it's not necessary. Sometimes, depending on the piece that I'm going to use this with, to really draw attention to the number, I want that solid color, or that semi-solid color, where I have the outline and the filler stitches to be the same color. Now right over here I can see I went a little high with that stitch, so I'm just going to remove it from my needle and pull it out, rethread my needle, and start that stitch over. Again, I want to make my stitches just a little smaller on the curves, and this just bring them to the end of that number. So once I have my number on the back, I'll just knot it. And as you can see, I have my quilt piece here, and all my little stitches, as well as the previous knots. So that's how I make a stitched number on my pieces. You can do them as simple as you want, with just some little stitches here that outline the number, or you can fill them in however you like. And of course, I have my favorite one that I'm going to save in my art journal. So that's how I slow stitch numerals to use in my pieces. I really like stitching text, or in this case numbers, because it marks something completely human, completely man-made, almost a language in itself. You can commemorate dates, birthdays, numbers of subscribers like I've done here. So once again, a big thank you to everyone who subscribed. I can't believe I've made 10,000 subscribers. Thank you for joining me today. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe.